UFC 269. I see some things, I smell some things, I hear some things. We're going to talk about all those things today. You can call me Kunith. Let's make some money this week. If you haven't had a chance already, go back and watch the first look video from earlier in the week. That's where we talk about the slate fighter by fighter, salary by salary, and we talk about spots that we like and spots that we don't like. For this final look, what we'll be focusing on is lineup construction, what we need to do to be successful, and some things that I've noticed throughout the week that I really want to touch on in this video. And if you've been enjoying the content at all, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, that way I can bring more of this to you. First, I want to touch on just the number of fights that we have. It's important to understand what's going on here. There's a good chance we don't end up having 15 fights total by the time Saturday comes around. There's COVID, there's weigh-ins, anything can happen, and things like this happen all the time. But what's important is that you're making sure that you're not playing people who aren't fighting, and I know how simple that sounds, but I was in single entry contests last week, and not just for a couple of dollars, you had to pay to play, and there were people that were playing 5 fighters in these contests, only 5, immediately taking themselves out of contention. Don't do that. Don't be that guy. But also, with having so many fights, you don't need to stack the 5-rounders. If you've been watching, you know I'm not a fan of that. I see the appeal because of the floor that it provides, but when you look at how these fights are probably going to play out, the losers in each of them shouldn't be scoring that many points. Juliana Pena won't score well at all. And I don't see the main event going the distance, so I don't think the loser of that fight is going to score you very many points. It would actually be nice if one of these fights looked like they were going the distance so that we could stack, because the pricing on this card is tight. I've been tinkering with lineups throughout the week, and it's been difficult because a lot of these premium options, salaried above 9,000, look really good. Amanda Nunes will post a good DraftKings score. Bruno Silva looks poised for a first round finish. He may even get the quick win finish, depending on how aggressive Jordan Wright comes in. Alex Perez is a top flyweight in a favorable matchup who's going to go low owned. And Sean O'Malley's a knockout artist who's fighting somebody who's pretty hittable. So these all look like fantastic and safe plays. I didn't mention Jillian Robertson only because of her limited upside. I expect her to win, but in her victory, she scores a little bit less than the other 4 fighters that we mentioned in that premium range, and she doesn't seem live for a finish, at least inside of the first round. If that fight does get finished in the first round, it's probably because she's getting knocked out. I don't expect that to happen. I expect Jillian Robertson to win this fight, dominate this fight, and post a good score on DraftKings, but her first round finishing ability is limited compared to those other options in the top range, so she's going to be somebody I stay away from. I'm going to go to fighters like Bruno Silva, Alex Perez, before I go to Jillian Robertson. And while this top range is great, you're probably only going to be able to get away with playing 2 of them this week. Now, you can build lineups with 3 of them. You just might find yourself in a position where you're playing 1 to 2 fighters who you're not all that comfortable with. So you may want to target some of the fighters in the mid-range that you feel good about and build your lineups around them. Personally, I like Andre Muniz, Tai Tuivasa, and Dominic Cruz in this range, and in that order. One thing I would not recommend this week, though, is leaving salary on the table because of how tight the pricing is and because of how good a lot of these favorites look. We talked about leaving salary on the table last week, and again, the optimal lineup would have left 2,900 of it on the table. That's because fighters like Jamal Hill, Chris Curtis, and Clay Guida not only won their fights, but got finishes as well. And then Aldo wins as somebody priced below 8,000 in the main event. So that's why that lineup would have been optimal. Now, the underdogs this week don't look great, but there are some value spots that I want to get into. Plays at 8,000 and below. Jeff Neal at 8,000 is starting to look like a very interesting play. Earlier in the week, I wasn't too high on him. Ponzinibbio is a good striker with solid power and output, but the more that I look at this fight, the more that I like Jeff Neal. People aren't as high on Jeff Neal as they once were after suffering back-to-back losses to Wonderboy and Neil Magny. He had trouble closing distance on Wonderboy, and he was picked apart from the outside, but there's not a whole lot of shame in that. If Ponzinibbio were to fight Wonderboy, he'd lose every round. Then he fought Neil Magny, who was able to take him down, control the pace of the fight, and ultimately win a decision. But Ponzinibbio isn't that kind of fighter. He's not going to be shooting for a ton of takedowns. In fact, he's probably going to want to stand and bang in the pocket, and that's why I like Jeff Neal this week. If you look at the people that Ponzinibbio has fought in the UFC, you'll notice that his resume doesn't contain a whole lot of big power punchers. The one big power puncher that he did fight was Li Jingliang, and he got knocked out in the first round. And let's not forget why a lot of the MMA community was so high on Geoff Neal at one point. It was because of those hands of steel. Geoff Neal has never been an underdog in the UFC, mostly for that reason. He knocked out Mike Perry. No one knocks out Mike Perry. His $8,000 price tag, it's speaking to me because it lets you do so many other things with your lineup. I like the power this week. I like Geoff Neal this week. At 7,600, you have the champ. He's going to be very high owned, obviously, but it's for good reason. If Poirier didn't beat Conor McGregor, the salaries would be flipped. Poirier would be 7,600, Do Bronx would be 8,600. Those wins over McGregor are likely huge factors that are driving that line up. People think that he's going to win because he beat Conor McGregor. And I'm not convinced that he should be the favorite in this spot. When you look at Dustin Poirier's run at 155 pounds, you see guys like Pettis, Gaethje, Alvarez, Holloway, Hooker, McGregor. People talk about Charles Oliveira not having heart. Look at Anthony Pettis. As for Gaethje, Alvarez, Hooker, they're all great strikers, but they also will get into a slugfest. Max Holloway is a featherweight, and Conor McGregor is not who he once was. The only time Poirier was booked against an elite grappler, it was in Khabib, where he did nothing, was taken down 7 times, and ultimately submitted in the 3rd. And this is why we love the champion. I think Charles Oliveira submits him at some point. He's got the most diverse and active submission game in the UFC, and he wastes no time looking for the finish. If Poirier presents an opportunity for Charles to take him down, or if he lets him clinch him and jump on his back, the fight's over. And Charles isn't completely outmatched on the feet either. Poirier gets into these brawls, right? Controlled brawls, controlled chaos, but he's willing to take one to give one. And Charles is sharp. He could definitely end up catching him at some point. So I'm taking the champion in this one. And still, at 7,400, Dan Ige probably wins you a decision. I went into detail on the first look about why I'm not so high on Josh Emmett. So if you haven't watched, go back and watch it. There's a lot of things that are covered in that video that isn't covered in this one. I like Dan Ige as the younger fighter. Again, granite chin, solid output. He has his 2 losses in the UFC to Calvin Kattar and Korean Zombie, but he wasn't finished in either of those fights. And I think that Calvin Kattar and Korean Zombie, they would both beat Josh Emmett. Dan Ige has been a lot more active as of late. That's something that we always like to see. And again, the pick for me is Dan Ige, probably by decision. I expect it to be a very close fight. I think that he might even lose a round and win 29-28. So I'm not expecting a ton of DraftKings points out of him. But if you need some salary relief, he looks like a viable option down here in the pricing. $7,200 Tony Kelly wins this fight. Believe it, I'm sticking to it. There's a lot being made of Randy Costa aligning with Sanford MMA. We expect him to have a more measured approach and have a better game plan coming into this. By better game plan, I mean don't gas out and lose. The issue with that is that it's rare when we see a fighter do a complete 180 with mindset and how they approach the fight. Randy Costa and his coaches can think, okay, let's make sure that we take our time here. We don't need to rush the finish. Just let the finish come to us. By the time that cage door closes, that could totally go all out the window. I could see a situation where he lands a good shot, gets a big reaction out of Tony Kelly, and then aggressively looks for the finish. And then the horn rings and we got to go into round 2 and he's cooked to the bone. Or I could see a situation where Tony Kelly just makes it a gritty fight from the beginning, pushes him against the cage, starts working in some grappling. Not because I think he's a better grappler, but just because it's a grueling fight. He can do that for 15 minutes. Randy Costa has shown that he can't. So if he gets even one takedown, just the energy exerted for Randy Costa getting back up, it might be enough to sap his gas tank, and you're going to have a fighter who is fatigued going into the 2nd, maybe 3rd round, and a fighter like Tony Kelly who's scrappy and is going to fight till the end. There are fighters that don't have great gas tanks but are able to coast to the end, at least in a way that they're still in the fight. Randy Costa doesn't seem to be one of those guys, though. It seems like it's all or nothing with him. So Tony Kelly at 7,200, I'm putting him in a lot of my lineups as I'm building them throughout the week just because he makes so many other things work. You have to think most people are going to play Amanda Nunes, Charles Oliveira, just basically stack them together, and then you have to get different in 4 different spots. Here are some ways to get different this week. MMA DFS is not about playing the best fighters, it's normally about having the most unique lineup. Alex Perez at 9,200, I'm confident that he's going to be the lowest owned fighter in that price range. Dominic Cruz and Pedro Munoz, I don't think that fight's going to carry a ton of ownership. Same could be said about the Miranda Maverick Aaron Blanchfield fight. I wouldn't recommend it, but it's definitely not going to come in at high ownership. I would expect Miranda Maverick to have the lion's share of the ownership from that fight, but if only 10% of the people in your contest play it, maybe she'll get 7% to 3% for Erin Blanchfield. Andre Muniz in a very favorable matchup at 8,500 might be going under people's radar at DraftKings. Keep in mind, people are going to be all over the 5-round fights. Sean O'Malley. I could actually see Sean O'Malley coming in at higher ownership than Bruno Silva, and Bruno Silva's in a much better matchup for just a few hundred more. He's fighting Jordan Wright, who's borderline chinny, and Raulian Paiva's the opposite of that. He's going to eat a lot of these shots O'Malley sends his way and keep coming forward. Oh, and don't forget Ryan Hall. He's pretty good. If you have any questions about your lineup that you want me to answer, throw it down in the comments. I'll respond to it within minutes, especially if it's close to lock. Let me know and I'll be able to help as best as I can. But that's it. That's the final look. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. That way I can bring more of this to you.